The courtroom was dead silent. The tension hung heavy in the air as all eyes were on the little girl sitting in the witness box. Her name was Tiana. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but there was something in her eyes, a sharpness, a knowing, beyond her years. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her little feet barely touching the floor, her head slightly lowered, almost as though she were trying to avoid the weight of the stares directed at her. On the other side of the room, the defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a well-tailored suit, stood fidgeting with his notes. His voice had just died down after asking Tiana yet another round of questions that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. The prosecution was waiting too, their team in quiet anticipation. But it wasn't just the lawyers that were nervous, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would happen next. But it wasn't just the adults in the room that felt the weight of this moment. It was Tiana who truly held the power. Her eyes darted to the corner of the courtroom, to where a large black dog lay quietly under the bench. The dog, Max, was unusually calm. His head rested on his paws, his eyes wide but unblinking, watching Tiana closely. Then, without a sound, Tiana gave him a subtle signal, just a slight flick of her fingers. A secret signal that only Max understood. Max's ears perked up immediately, his body stiffening. The room seemed to pause for a split second, the tension thickening in the air. And then, without warning, the dog stood up. It was as though he'd received a command only he could hear. He padded across the room, weaving around the legs of the seated lawyers and spectators, each step deliberate, his eyes fixed firmly on the judge's stand. The judge, a man in his late 50s with a graying beard, was watching all this unfold with a raised eyebrow. He leaned forward in his seat, his gaze flicking from Tiana to Max, to the defense lawyer and then back to the little girl. The audience was on the edge of their seats, unsure of what to make of this strange interaction. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer started, his voice rising in confusion, this is highly irregular. "We did not." The judge cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Order," he barked, his tone firm. "I'm trying to understand what's happening here. Little girl, can you please explain what you just did?" Tiana's tiny hands were still folded in her lap, but her fingers twitched slightly. She knew exactly what she had to do, but she wasn't sure how much she could say. She glanced down at Max again, who had now positioned himself directly in front of the judge's podium, his posture stiff and alert. The audience was silent, watching in awe. I didn't do anything, sir," Tiana said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Max, whose gaze remained fixed on her, as though waiting for the next instruction. She couldn't explain it, there was a bond between them, something unspoken, something deeper than words. The judge seemed perplexed but intrigued. He glanced down at Max, then back at Tiana. "Miss Tiana, did you just give your dog a signal? Something that, perhaps only he understands?" Tiana hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. She looked back at Max, and for a brief moment, it was as though the world had slowed down. Her heart raced as the memories flooded her mind. She and Max had been through so much together, both of them had been through the toughest times in their lives, and Max had always been there for her. She trusted him with her life. I gave him a signal, but it's not what you think," she said, finally finding the courage to speak. He's special. He can help. He knows what's happening." The judge looked at her with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean, he knows what's happening? This is a courtroom, Miss Tiana, not a circus." He tried to maintain his authority, but there was something about the way she spoke that made him pause. Tiana blinked. She wanted to explain, to say more, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Max was more than just a dog. He was her protector. And even if the world didn't understand it, he always knew when something was wrong. He always knew when it was time to act. There was a sudden rustling from the back of the courtroom. Max's ears perked up again, and without hesitation, he darted toward the doors, where a figure was standing in the hallway. The figure was dressed in a black suit, and Tiana's eyes widened when she saw who it was. It was her mother. Her mother, who had been missing for the past 2 years, suddenly appeared in the doorway. She looked different, older, perhaps, worn by time and struggles Tiana couldn't even begin to understand. But there she was, standing right in front of her daughter, as if nothing had ever happened. The entire courtroom erupted into chaos. Whispers filled the air as the judge stood up, his gavel hitting the desk with a sharp thud. "Order," he shouted again. "What is going on here?" Tiana's heart was racing. She didn't know how to process what was happening, but she could feel the flood of emotions rising within her. She had always hoped for this moment, that her mother would come back, that things would go back to the way they used to be. But now, as she looked at the woman who had abandoned her, she realized she wasn't sure what to feel anymore. Max stood by her side, as though sensing her inner turmoil. He looked up at her with his dark, wise eyes, and for a brief moment, Tiana felt a strange sense of calm. Max had always been there when she needed him the most. Now, it was time for him to help her again. The judge sat back down, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. I need a moment," he muttered, his hand rubbing his forehead. Tiana swallowed hard, standing up slowly from the witness stand. The room was still buzzing with disbelief. And yet, amid all the chaos, Tiana knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning of something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. But for now, as she stood there in front of her mother, with Max by her side, Tiana knew she wasn't alone. And that gave her strength. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Tiana stood frozen, staring at the woman in the doorway. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat feeling like a loud drum in her ears. She had thought about this moment countless times. She had imagined the reunion, the emotions, the questions, but now that it was real, nothing seemed to make sense. The woman in front of her, her mother, looked tired, worn down by time and struggles Tiana couldn't even begin to comprehend. But she was there. Alive. And that alone was enough to send a rush of confusion through Tiana's young mind. Max, her dog, stood protectively at her side, his body tense, but he was as still as a stone, sensing that something significant was happening. The people in the courtroom were speaking in hushed whispers, and the judge, still in a state of shock, had momentarily lost his authority. He was watching this unfolding drama with wide eyes, unsure of how to process the situation. But there was one thing that Tiana was certain of: her mother had come back for a reason. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls tightening around her chest as she tried to make sense of it all. For so long, it had been just her and Max. He had been her comfort, her protector, the one thing that had never let her down. But now her mother was here, and she had no idea why. "Mom," Tiana whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a tentative step toward the woman standing in the doorway, her mind racing. Was it really her? Was this some kind of trick? Her mother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped into the courtroom slowly, her eyes locked on Tiana. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, as though the years had taken a toll on her in ways that Tiana couldn't even begin to understand. She was dressed in a dark, weathered coat that looked out of place in the formal setting of the courtroom. Her hands were trembling, and her lips were pressed into a thin line, as though she were holding something back. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Tiana could feel the eyes of every single person on her, and for the first time, she felt like she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Her mother had vanished without a trace 2 years ago. She had been told that she was gone, maybe dead, maybe lost forever. But now here she was, standing in front of her. "Mom, where were you?" Tiana managed to ask, her voice a mixture of anger, confusion, and a deep yearning for answers. Her mother's face softened just slightly, but her eyes still held a guarded, distant look. "Tiana," she began, her voice rough, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm here now. I've been trying to figure out how to come back to you, but it wasn't safe before." "Not safe?" Tiana repeated, feeling a sharp sting in her chest. "What do you mean it wasn't safe? You left me with Grandma, and now Grandma's gone." Tiana's voice cracked as she spoke, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the pain she had buried deep inside for so long. Her grandmother had been the only family she had left after her mother disappeared. But now, even she was gone, killed in a car accident. Tiana had barely been able to understand what had happened to her grandmother, let alone cope with the grief that followed. And now, her mother was back, but it felt too late. Too much had changed. Tiana's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She refused to cry in front of everyone in this cold courtroom. The last thing she wanted was for people to see her weakness. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she didn't need her mother. But now that she was standing right there, the floodgates were threatening to open. Max seemed to sense her distress. He nudged her gently with his nose, bringing her back to the present. His eyes were kind, filled with understanding, as though he knew exactly what she was feeling. He was always there for her, no matter what. "Mom, where were you?" Tiana asked again, her voice more forceful this time, the emotions bubbling to the surface. Her mother hesitated before answering, her eyes darting around the room nervously, as though she were afraid of something or someone. I couldn't tell you everything back then, Tiana. But I promise, I never wanted to leave you. There are things I need to explain, things you won't understand now, but I will. I need time." Tiana's heart raced. Time? How much time? How long had her mother been gone? And why had she never come back for her? The more Tiana thought about it, the more she felt a sense of betrayal building up inside her. How could she just leave her like that? Didn't she care? "I don't want to hear your excuses." Tiana blurted out, her voice trembling. You left me." The words stung both of them. Her mother flinched at the outburst, but Tiana didn't care. She was tired of hiding her pain, of pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. She had been so strong for so long, but now, with her mother standing in front of her, she couldn't hold it in anymore. Max growled softly beside her, his protective instincts kicking in. He stepped forward, as if to shield Tiana from the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Enough," the judge said, his voice firm, though he still looked shocked by the whole situation. He looked at Tiana, then at her mother. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to explain yourself. This is a court of law, and we are here to seek the truth, not to witness a personal drama unfold." Tiana's mother looked at the judge, then back at her daughter, her face filled with sadness. "I understand," she said quietly. "But this is part of the truth. I'm here because I think Tiana can help solve what happened. What happened to her grandmother, and what happened to me." The courtroom went silent again, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Tiana's head spun. She didn't understand what her mother meant, but something about the way she said it made Tiana uneasy. There was more to this than she had been told. And now, somehow, Tiana was at the center of it all. "Your Honor, we need to suspend this trial for a moment," the defense lawyer interjected, his voice trembling. This new development is far too important to overlook." The judge nodded slowly, his gavel rising into the air. "I agree. Court is recessed for the time being." As the room began to clear, Tiana stayed in her seat, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing: the story was far from over. The gavel slammed down with an echoing thud, signaling the temporary recess. The noise of the courtroom started to fade into the background as the weight of what had just happened settled over Tiana. Her eyes were still locked on her mother, who was standing near the door, looking more fragile than ever. The chaotic whispers of the spectators were drowned out by the pounding of Tiana's heart. She could barely breathe, her mind tangled in a web of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Max, sensing her distress, stayed close, his calm presence grounding her in the midst of the whirlwind around them. His large, dark eyes never left her face, offering the silent support he had always given her. He was the only constant in her life, the one who had never abandoned her. Tiana stood up slowly from the witness stand, her legs feeling weak, as though the weight of the moment was too much to bear. She glanced at her mother again, but this time, there was something in the way the woman looked at her, something unfamiliar. It was as if she wasn't just seeing her daughter, but was also seeing a stranger. Tiana's chest tightened. Had her mother changed so much in the time she had been gone? Or was it Tiana who had changed? She barely recognized the little girl she used to be. Before Tiana could make sense of her thoughts, the defense attorney approached her, his face etched with concern. "Miss Tiana, are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice gentle. "I know this is difficult, but we need to take a break. You don't have to go back to the stand just yet." Tiana shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. She could barely form a coherent thought, let alone engage in a conversation. She needed time. She needed to process what had just happened, but most of all, she needed answers. Max nudged her gently, his head pressing against her side, and Tiana, without even thinking, instinctively reached down to pet him. She could feel his warm, solid presence beside her, and somehow, that made everything feel a little bit more bearable. Max had always been her protector, her companion in every moment of fear, loneliness, and confusion. He was her rock, and right now, she needed him more than ever. "Maybe we should go outside for a bit," the defense attorney said. "You can catch your breath. I'm sure things will calm down soon." Tiana didn't respond, but she nodded slowly. She needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom, to get away from the stares and the questions that she couldn't answer. She turned and followed the attorney toward the exit, her feet dragging with each step. The heavy door of the courtroom swung open, and the cool air outside hit her face like a slap, momentarily shocking her senses. The small courtyard was quiet, save for a few scattered people talking in hushed voices, but none of them paid much attention to Tiana as she walked outside with Max at her side. The space felt vast, almost peaceful, but the overwhelming sense of confusion in her mind made it hard to relax. Her thoughts raced, and she could hardly make sense of anything. "Tiana, I know this is a lot to take in," the defense attorney said, breaking the silence. "But the court needs your testimony. You're the key to unraveling this case." Tiana looked up at him, but all she could manage was a blank stare. The words barely registered. The key to what? To what case? And why was she so important? Suddenly, her mind flashed back to her grandmother, how she had always told her stories. Strange stories. Stories about things that didn't seem to make sense at the time, but now felt like pieces of a puzzle she had never put together. Tiana's grandmother had always warned her about something important. She had often said that one day, Tiana would be the one to uncover the truth. Tiana swallowed hard, pushing the memory aside. She didn't want to think about her grandmother right now. Not when it hurt so much. But the more she tried to block out the memories, the clearer they became. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Tiana, one day you'll need to listen. The answers you seek won't always come from the people around you, but from something inside of you. Trust your instincts, and you'll find your way." The words haunted her as she tried to focus on the present. Her grandmother had always believed in her, believed that Tiana had a special gift, something she couldn't explain. But now, sitting here in the courtyard with her mother just inside the courtroom, Tiana had no idea how she was supposed to fulfill whatever it was her grandmother had been hinting at. A distant bark broke her thoughts, and she looked down at Max, who was standing still beside her. His posture was different now, more alert. He was watching the door to the courtroom with intense concentration. The tension in the air seemed to have shifted, and even though Tiana couldn't quite put her finger on it, she could feel that something was about to happen. Just as Tiana was about to ask the attorney to leave her alone for a moment, the door to the courtroom burst open, and her mother emerged. Her face was pale, her eyes still full of that distance Tiana had noticed before, but now there was something else, something urgent. She was looking right at Tiana, but there was fear in her eyes. "Tiana," her mother said, her voice shaky. "We need to talk. I have something to tell you. Something you need to know before it's too late." The word struck Tiana like a blow to the chest. "What do you mean?" Tiana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart pounded as her mother took a few steps forward, her eyes darting around nervously. "I'm not just here for the trial," her mother said, glancing over her shoulder, as though making sure no one was listening. "I came back because, there's something I've been hiding from you. Something I've been protecting you from. And it's time you knew the truth." Tiana felt a chill run through her, as though her mother's words had unleashed a cold wave of dread through her entire body. "What truth?" she asked, the fear now beginning to edge into her voice. Her mother took a deep breath, glancing again at the door to the courtroom. "You're part of something bigger than you know. And the signal Max gave you, he's trying to warn you. He's not just your dog, Tiana. He's been watching over you because he knows something the rest of us don't." Tiana blinked, her mind racing. Max? Her protector, her constant companion, was there more to him than she had ever imagined? "What do you mean?" Tiana whispered, her voice trembling. "What is he trying to warn me about?" Her mother's face was full of regret. "It's complicated, sweetheart. But you're about to find out. We don't have much time." Tiana's stomach twisted as a cold shiver ran down her spine. Max wasn't just a dog. She had always known there was something special about him, something that couldn't be explained, but now she had to know what it meant. What was going on? Her mother's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Tiana knew that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. But one thing was clear, the truth was out there, and she had to find it, before it was too late. Tiana's mind swirled with confusion and fear, each new piece of information she received only deepening the mystery surrounding her mother's sudden return. Max's alertness, her mother's cryptic words, and the unsettling feeling that something was looming, Tiana felt as if the world she knew had just been turned upside down. She wasn't sure what she had expected today, but it definitely wasn't this. Max, still standing beside her, seemed to sense her turmoil. He nuzzled her hand, his warm, familiar presence offering a sliver of comfort in a world that was suddenly full of shadows. Tiana glanced down at him, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar sense of urgency. There was something more to him, something hidden. But what? And why had her mother mentioned him in such a serious, almost fearful way? Her mother, still standing a few feet away, looked torn between rushing forward to explain and hesitating, as though waiting for the right moment to reveal everything. Tiana could feel the tension in the air, and for a moment, she considered walking away. She wanted to leave, to escape, to go back to her life before the storm of uncertainty had hit. But there was something deep inside her that kept her rooted to the spot. She needed to know the truth. She needed answers. Her mother broke the silence. "Tiana," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I need you to trust me. There's something very important happening right now. Something you can't ignore. The people in that courtroom, they're after something. Something that could put you in danger. But Max. He knows how to protect you." Tiana blinked in shock. "Max knows? He's just a dog. He's not." Her mother raised her hand, silencing her. "I know it sounds insane, but you have to believe me. Max isn't just any dog. He's part of a group, a very small, very secret group of creatures who were sent to watch over special children like you. Tiana's stomach dropped. Her mind couldn't process what she was hearing. Max? A creature? Was her mother seriously suggesting that her dog wasn't just a normal pet? He's not just a dog. Tiana whispered, the question hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Her mother nodded, her face grave. No. I know this is hard to understand, but it's true. Max has been with you for a reason. He's been guarding you, keeping you safe from things that would harm you. But there are forces out there who want to find you. They know you're special, Tiana. And they'll stop at nothing to get to you. Tiana took a step back, her mind racing. The words felt surreal, as though her mother were speaking a language she couldn't comprehend. The idea that Max, the same dog who had been her loyal companion through every hardship, was part of some greater, secretive plan was almost too much to take in. Why me? Tiana asked, her voice shaky. Why is all of this happening? What does it mean? Her mother hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting nervously around the courtyard. It was clear she didn't want to be overheard. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice even further. There are people in this world who are after something, something that has been hidden for generations. It's an ancient power, and it's tied to you, Tiana. You were born with a gift, a connection to this power. And Max has been sent to make sure you stay safe until you're ready to embrace it. Tiana's head spun. A gift? She had never felt special. She had always been the quiet, introverted girl who kept to herself, who found comfort in the company of her dog and the small circle of friends she had managed to hold on to. The idea that she was connected to some ancient power, that she had some kind of destiny, seemed impossible. But the more her mother spoke, the more she began to sense that everything she had known about her life was about to change. I don't understand, Tiana whispered, her voice barely audible. How do you know all of this? How do you know about me? About Max? Her mother sighed, her expression softening. I didn't want to involve you in this. I didn't want you to know. But now it's too late. You're already involved. The people who want this power, they're not going to stop until they get what they're after. And Max. He's been sent to help you find your way. He's not just a dog. He's part of the reason you're still alive. The signal you saw him give, it's part of the plan. He's been guiding you. Tiana's heart skipped a beat. The signal, she hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now that her mother mentioned it, everything began to click into place. The strange way Max had behaved around certain people, the way he had always seemed to sense danger before it arrived, and the way he had acted just before her mother showed up. It wasn't just coincidence. Max was trying to tell her something, trying to guide her toward a truth that had been hidden from her for her entire life. Signal? Tiana repeated, still trying to piece together what her mother was saying. What do you mean by that? What was he trying to tell me? Her mother glanced around once more, making sure no one was watching. Then, she took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what was to come. Max was trying to tell you that the time has come. The time to understand who you really are, what you're capable of. There's a choice you'll have to make soon, Tiana. A choice that could change everything. But you'll have to trust Max to guide you through it. Tiana's mind reeled with the weight of her mother's words. A choice? What kind of choice? Her mother's eyes were full of regret. The choice to embrace your power. To accept who you really are, and what you must do to protect it. There are others out there, Tiana, people like me, who will help you. But there are also those who want to use your gift for evil. And when the time comes, you'll have to decide which side you're on. Max, who had been silent through their conversation, suddenly whined softly, his head turned toward the entrance of the courtyard. His eyes were intense, his body poised, as if he sensed something coming. The hairs on the back of Tiana's neck stood up. "Max," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What is it?" Her mother's expression darkened. "It's starting," she said softly. "The people who want you are here. You need to go. Now." Tiana's breath caught in her throat as she looked at her mother. The words were clear, "Run." It was time to leave, time to act. But where would she go? Who could she trust? The only thing she knew for sure was that Max was her protector, and if he was ready, so was she. Her mother's eyes locked onto hers with a pleading intensity. "Please, Tiana. You have to go. They're close. Don't let them find you." Max barked suddenly, breaking the tension. His alertness told Tiana everything she needed to know. The danger was real. It was time for them to move. As Tiana turned to leave, her heart heavy with uncertainty, she glanced back at her mother one last time. "I'll find you. I don't know how, but I will," she whispered. Her mother nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I believe in you, Tiana." With one final glance at the woman who had brought her into this world and had abandoned her for so long, Tiana turned and ran. Tiana's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as she and Max rushed through the courtyard, her heart pounding in her chest. The feeling of urgency that had gripped her mother now clung to Tiana like a second skin. The world had shifted in an instant, and the once familiar had become a terrifying unknown. Her legs moved on autopilot, carrying her away from the only place she had ever known as safe. But where could she go now? Max trotted beside her, his body taut, alert to every sound, every movement. Tiana's mind was reeling. Her mother's cryptic words echoed in her head like an ominous warning. "You're special. Max is here to protect you. The people who want you are close." What did it all mean? She'd never felt special. Max had always been just her dog, a loyal companion, her best friend. How could he be a part of something so much bigger than she had ever imagined? And what was this mysterious gift she supposedly had? The choice she had to make. Her feet barely touched the ground as they moved down the alleyway, the high brick walls closing in on both sides. Max's pace didn't falter, his head constantly turning this way and that, as if he were scanning for threats. His instincts were impeccable, and Tiana had learned long ago to trust them. But now, more than ever, she had to trust herself too. "Where do we go?" Tiana muttered to herself, her voice barely audible above the sound of her racing footsteps. Max stopped suddenly, his body rigid. Tiana barely had time to react before he let out a low growl. Tiana's heart skipped a beat. She immediately froze, her senses heightening. She could feel it too, something wasn't right. From the corner of her eye, she saw shadows move against the walls. Figures, tall and cloaked, moving swiftly, almost blending into the dark corners of the alleyway. They were closing in. Tiana's pulse quickened. They were here. Max let out another growl, this one more forceful. It was clear now, the people her mother had warned her about were after her. "Max, what do we do?" she whispered, though she knew he couldn't answer her. Still, she hoped he could somehow lead her to safety. Max's gaze darted toward a narrow opening between two buildings. The alley stretched ahead, but the path was blocked. The only option left was the dark gap. Without hesitation, Tiana bolted toward it, Max close behind. The narrow passage was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but she could feel the weight of the pursuing footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Her mind was a blur of panic, but a part of her instinctively trusted Max's sense of direction. He was leading her, and he had never steered her wrong. She pushed through the gap, her body scraping against the rough stone, Max following closely behind. As they reached the other side, Tiana stumbled into an empty street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They had left the shadows behind, but the danger was still there, just out of sight, like a storm brewing on the horizon. "Max," she said, her voice trembling. "Where do we go now?" Max barked sharply, his attention focused on a narrow side street ahead. Tiana followed his gaze. There was an old, abandoned building that seemed to beckon them, a place that could hide them for a while, give them time to think, time to regroup. She didn't hesitate. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed, she darted toward the building, pushing open a creaky metal door. It groaned loudly in protest, but the empty street didn't show any signs of life. Tiana and Max were alone again, but they knew it wouldn't be for long. Inside, the building was dark and cold, the air stale with the scent of dust and decay. The walls were lined with graffiti, remnants of a place long forgotten. Tiana's footfalls echoed eerily as she moved further in, Max right at her side, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. Tiana leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. She slid down, her legs giving way as the adrenaline of the chase began to ebb. She was safe, for now. But only for now. Max stood vigilantly nearby, his body tense as he continued to survey the area. Tiana couldn't stop shaking. The moment had been so surreal, so overwhelming. She wasn't just running from a trial anymore. She wasn't just caught up in something she didn't understand. There was something much bigger going on. Her mind raced back to her mother's words, "There are people out there who want you. They're after something." And Max? He wasn't just her dog. He had a purpose. He was guarding her. Protecting her. Tiana leaned her head back against the wall, letting out a long, shaky breath. She was trying to process everything, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the truth was, she didn't have the answers. She didn't even know where to begin looking for them. As she sat there, her hand instinctively reached for the pendant around her neck, the one her grandmother had given her years ago. It was a simple silver locket, unremarkable in appearance, but it had always been a source of comfort for Tiana. It had belonged to her grandmother, and after she passed away, Tiana kept it close, convinced that it held some sort of meaning. It had always felt like a connection to the woman who had told her those strange stories, who had spoken of hidden truths and forces beyond comprehension. Tiana ran her fingers over the locket, her thoughts swirling. Could it be part of the secret her mother was hiding? Suddenly, Max's ears perked up, his body rigid. His eyes darted to the door, then back to Tiana, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Tiana's heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were growing louder outside, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was tracking them was deliberately making their presence known. Tiana stood up quickly, her pulse quickening. Max barked sharply, his body tense, and Tiana knew it was time to move again. They couldn't stay here, they needed to keep running. Tiana's mind raced. But where could they go next? She couldn't stay on the streets for long. She needed to find someone she could trust. But who? And how could she know who to trust with the weight of the secret her mother had just revealed? Max looked at her again, and this time, his eyes seemed to hold a different kind of urgency. He wasn't just protecting her, he was guiding her. Somehow, he knew the way. Without another word, Tiana followed him, moving quickly through the darkened building and toward the back exit. As she pushed open another door, she could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps closing in behind them. Max barked again, urging her forward, and without a moment's hesitation, she ran into the night, the unknown future waiting just ahead. The city streets blurred around Tiana as she sprinted, her breath ragged and shallow. Max was right beside her, his paws echoing against the pavement, a constant presence of strength and guidance. Each step felt heavier than the last, but there was no time to slow down. She had no choice but to keep moving. The world felt distorted, surreal. A few hours ago, she was just an ordinary girl, navigating the uncertainty of her mother's return, uncertain of where she belonged. Now, her life had been thrown into chaos. A secret she didn't understand was unfolding before her, and she had no idea who she could trust or where she could turn. Max's growl broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She turned quickly to find him staring ahead, his body stiff, ears alert. He had stopped running, his nose twitching, as if sensing something far beyond her comprehension. The alley ahead was dark, the shadows pressing in like a suffocating fog. "Max, what is it?" Tiana whispered, her voice trembling. She crouched beside him, her hand resting gently on his head, searching his eyes for an answer. But Max was focused, utterly focused, on the entrance to the alleyway. His posture was one of warning, and Tiana's pulse quickened as she began to feel it too. They were being watched. Tiana straightened, her heart racing. She instinctively wanted to run, but Max's calmness held her in place, his deep eyes locking with hers. "Stay still," they seemed to say. She felt it, the calm before the storm. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Max, show me what to do." And then it happened. Max's low growl shifted to a series of quick barks. In that moment, Tiana could have sworn she saw something shimmer in the air in front of him, like a ripple in the very fabric of reality. For a brief second, it felt as if time had slowed, as if the world was bending in on itself. Tiana gasped, her mind spinning. Was this real? Or was she imagining it? Max didn't hesitate. With a quick, decisive leap, he bounded forward, pulling Tiana with him. She barely had time to react as Max raced toward a small, seemingly insignificant door at the back of a dilapidated building. The door was hidden behind a layer of ivy and vines, almost completely camouflaged by the surrounding overgrowth. But Max knew it was there, and he was already heading for it. Tiana's instincts kicked in, and she followed. She barely had time to think about what she was doing, all she knew was that Max was guiding her. The moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening sound that echoed down the alley. The room they entered was dimly lit, the air musty with the scent of old wood and stone. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that made Tiana's skin crawl, it was the eerie quiet, the unsettling stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Max led her further into the room, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. It was then that she noticed the faint sound of voices, whispers, coming from the far corner. Tiana froze. The voices grew louder, clearer, and she instinctively stepped back. But Max was already at her side, his presence an unspoken reassurance. It was as if he knew what was coming, as if he was preparing her for the truth she had been running from. Tiana turned to him, her heart pounding. "What is this place, Max? What's going on?" Max's gaze met hers. His eyes, normally filled with warmth and loyalty, were now serious, almost knowing. He barked twice, sharply, before moving toward the source of the whispers. Tiana hesitated but followed, her steps hesitant, though she trusted him more than she could explain. As they moved deeper into the room, the voices grew clearer, and Tiana soon realized that they were coming from a group of people standing in a circle at the center of the room. Their faces were hidden in shadow, and their low murmurs sent chills down her spine. They were gathered around something. Tiana couldn't make out the details, but she could feel that whatever they were standing around was important. Max paused beside her, his body stiff, eyes narrowing in the direction of the group. His growl was barely audible, but it carried the weight of something ancient, something deeply protective. Tiana knew that whatever was about to happen, this was the place where it would all be revealed. One of the figures in the circle, the tallest, a man with a deep, gravelly voice, spoke. "She's here," he said, his words like a command. Tiana's heart lurched. They knew who she was. A woman in the group, cloaked in black, turned sharply, her eyes locking onto Tiana's. "It's her, isn't it?" she asked, her voice filled with both awe and suspicion. Max stepped forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Tiana. He let out a low, warning growl, his eyes unwavering. The tall man raised a hand, signaling for the group to step back. "We've waited for this moment for a long time," he said, his voice cold and distant. "You've come for the power, just as we predicted." Tiana stepped back instinctively, confusion and fear swirling inside her. What are you talking about? I don't understand. I'm not. I don't have anything special. The woman in black smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. You have everything. You just don't know it yet. Tiana shook her head, her thoughts spinning. No. This is a mistake. I don't know you. I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not part of any prophecy or whatever this is. Max growled again, his fur standing on end. Tiana could feel his protective energy radiating from him. He wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a companion. He was a protector. The man stepped forward, his gaze piercing. You don't have a choice. The choice was made the moment you were born. And now, the time has come for you to take your place. Tiana felt a chill race down her spine. Take my place where? What do you mean? The world is changing, the man said, his voice lower now, almost reverent. Your gift, your power, it has been awakened. It's time for you to embrace it. And you will need all the strength you can gather because they are coming for you. A rush of panic surged through Tiana. She had always believed her life was normal, just like everyone else's. But now, standing in the dim light of this strange room, surrounded by people who knew more about her than she did, she realized one terrifying truth: nothing was normal anymore. Max's growl softened, but his eyes remained focused on the man in front of her. His warning was clear. Tiana took a step back, her heart racing. I'm not ready for this. The woman in black stepped forward, her eyes softening for the first time. No one is. But it's too late now. The only thing you can do is embrace who you are. Max gave one final, sharp bark, his gaze fixed on the entrance of the room, alert. They're here, the man muttered, his voice grim. Tiana's breath caught in her throat. The chase had only just begun. Tiana's heart pounded as the man's words reverberated in her mind. They're here. The weight of those words crushed her chest, and a cold sweat broke out across her brow. The shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, the air thick with tension. Max, still positioned protectively in front of her, growled low and menacingly, his body coiled with readiness. Tiana's eyes flicked toward the entrance, her mind racing. Who was coming for her? And why? She didn't even know who she was, let alone why anyone would be chasing her. The tall man in the circle looked grim as he raised a hand to silence the group, his sharp eyes fixed on the doorway. The others followed suit, their bodies tense and alert. The room seemed to grow colder, the faint sound of footsteps outside the door carrying the weight of imminent danger. Max's growl deepened, and Tiana felt her pulse race. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life. Something had shifted, something had awakened within her, and there was no turning back. A moment passed, but it felt like hours. Then, the door to the room creaked, and the shadowy figures at the entrance slowly began to materialize. They were here. Tiana's stomach twisted as the air seemed to crackle with energy. One of the cloaked figures, tall and cloaked in a dark, flowing robe, stepped forward. He had the air of someone accustomed to control, his eyes hidden behind a shadowy hood. His presence exuded a chilling power, one that sent a shiver down Tiana's spine. The tall man who had spoken earlier didn't flinch. His voice, calm but resolute, broke the heavy silence. We knew you'd come. But it's too late to stop this now. Tiana's eyes darted from one figure to the next. There were 4 of them, each as imposing as the last. They moved toward her with deliberate, controlled steps, their faces still obscured by the darkness of their hoods. But something in their posture, something in the way they moved, told her they weren't just random strangers. They were here for a purpose. A purpose that revolved around her. Max stood firm, his body tense, a low growl still rumbling from deep within his chest. He positioned himself squarely between Tiana and the intruders, his eyes narrowed with intent. "Stay back," the man in the hooded cloak said, his voice cold and calculating. "We've waited long enough. The time has come for you to fulfill your destiny, girl. Whether you want to or not." Tiana's mind whirled. Destiny? She had no idea what he was talking about. She was just an ordinary girl. Until a few hours ago, she had been living her life as best she could, grappling with her mother's absence and trying to figure out who she really was. Now, she was being told she was part of some grand destiny, and she had no clue what that meant. But one thing was certain, these people wanted something from her. "Why me?" Tiana demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound strong. "What do you want from me? I'm just a kid." The hooded figure took a step forward, his voice dark and ominous. "You are not just a kid. You are the key to everything. To the future. To the power that lies dormant within you. We have been waiting for you, Tiana." The use of her name sent a chill through her. How did they know her name? She had never seen them before. Her heart pounded louder in her chest as she glanced to Max, who remained perfectly still, his body taut with alertness. He was her rock, her protector. And yet, in this moment, even Max seemed to sense the danger that surrounded them. The woman in black, one of the cloaked figures, stepped forward and spoke in a soft but deliberate tone. "You don't understand yet, do you? The gift inside you isn't just a gift. It's a power. And that power has been lying dormant, hidden, waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment has arrived." Tiana shook her head, trying to push down the rising fear. "Power? I don't have any power. I'm just, me." The tall man spoke again, his voice laced with a certain authority. "You don't know it yet, but your bloodline is far more than you've been led to believe. It's time for you to embrace your true nature. Time for you to stop running." Tiana's chest tightened. Embrace her true nature. The word sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, a far-off dream. She wasn't special. She wasn't anything extraordinary. She was just Tiana. "Max," she whispered urgently, her fingers trembling as she reached out for him. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes full of calm assurance. Somehow, she knew he was telling her that now was the time to act. With one last glance at the cloaked figures, Tiana made her decision. She had to fight. Max barked once, sharp and commanding, before leaping forward, his body moving like a blur of muscle and fur. He went straight for the closest figure, a flash of fury and protective instinct in every movement. The cloaked man tried to dodge, but Max was faster, his sharp teeth snapping at the man's arm. The figure recoiled with a yelp, stumbling back. Tiana's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, but the woman in black moved quickly, her hands raised. "No," she shouted, her voice tinged with both fear and frustration. "Do not interfere." But it was too late. Max had already forced the group to scatter, his growls filling the room as the figures reeled back. Tiana felt the pulse of energy around her grow stronger, almost as if she could feel something stirring deep inside her. The tall man stepped forward again, a grim smile on his face. "So, you've decided to fight. But you won't be able to run forever, Tiana. It's time for you to face your destiny." Tiana took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just about running anymore. Max growled in warning, his body rigid, his stance protective. He was her anchor, the force that kept her grounded in the midst of all this madness. Tiana clenched her fists, her mind whirling with thoughts of escape. But this time, she didn't want to run. The room around her hummed with power. She could feel it now, deep inside her, an energy that had always been there, hidden, locked away, waiting to emerge. Tiana looked at the man, her voice trembling but determined. "You want me to face my destiny? Fine. But it won't be on your terms. I'm going to choose my own path. And with that, she stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, not as a helpless pawn, but as someone who was ready to fight. The storm had unleashed. The world would never be the same. Tiana stood tall, her pulse hammering in her ears as she faced the group of cloaked figures. Max, still poised and alert, remained by her side, his presence a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. The energy in the room crackled like static in the air, a tangible force pressing down on them all. She could feel it now, pulsing beneath her skin, her heart thumping in rhythm with the strange force. It was as if something inside her was waking up, something ancient, powerful, and untamed. The tall man in front of her sneered. You think you can fight destiny, girl? You think you can defy the very blood that runs through your veins? Tiana didn't respond immediately. She was still trying to wrap her mind around the chaos that had unfolded. A few hours ago, she was just a girl trying to figure out life, missing her mother and hoping for something to make sense. Now, she stood on the edge of something she could barely comprehend, faced with forces that wanted something from her, something powerful, something dangerous. Max let out a low growl, his ears flattening against his head. His hackles stood on end, as if sensing the rising tension. The cloaked figures moved with quiet precision, circling her like predators, but Tiana was no longer afraid. The fear that had once consumed her was slipping away, replaced by something else, something deep inside her that screamed for release. I don't know who you are, Tiana said, her voice steady, though every word felt like it came from a place she didn't recognize, but I will not let you control me. I'm not some tool for your plans. The woman in black, who had been eerily silent until now, stepped forward. You are much more than you realize, she said softly, almost pityingly. Her eyes seemed to pierce Tiana's very soul, as if she could see the confusion and fear still lingering within her. You've always known there was something different about you, haven't you? The way you can sense things before they happen, the way you can feel the emotions of others, the way you feel connected to things you shouldn't be able to understand. Tiana felt a cold chill run down her spine. It was as if this woman could see inside her very mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She had spent so many years trying to ignore the strange things that had always been a part of her, her dreams, her intuition, the way she could sense the feelings of people around her. But she had never known what they meant, only that they set her apart from everyone else. And now, it seemed, they were all connected to something she couldn't yet grasp. Max barked sharply, breaking the tense silence, and Tiana turned to him, as if seeking comfort in his unwavering loyalty. His eyes were still focused on the group, his body tense, ready to spring into action at the slightest threat. He was her protector, her guide, but even Max seemed uncertain about the force gathering in the room. You want me to accept this power, Tiana said slowly, her voice firming. But you're not explaining what it means. What do you want from me? The tall man's eyes gleamed, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. You don't understand yet. But you will. Soon enough. You are the one we have been waiting for, the one who will restore balance. Your power is the key to everything. Tiana's heart skipped a beat. Restoring balance. What did that even mean? She had never been a hero, never been anyone special. She was just a girl, trying to figure out where she fit in the world. But now, it seemed like the world was insisting that she had a role to play, one far larger than she could have ever imagined. The woman in black raised her hands, her eyes glowing faintly. The awakening has already begun. You can feel it, can't you? It's inside you, waiting to be unleashed. You're stronger than you know, Tiana. Tiana's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. Was this the power they were talking about? Was this the awakening? She had felt something stirring inside her, but it was so foreign, so strange, that she hadn't allowed herself to believe it could be real. But now, it felt undeniable. There was a force inside her, growing stronger by the second, like an ember that was slowly catching fire. Max growled again, his body coiled like a spring, ready to move. He knew something she didn't. He was in tune with the danger, in tune with the energy that seemed to be building around them. He barked sharply, his command clear. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. The man in the cloak laughed darkly. You think you can stop this? That dog of yours may protect you, but even he cannot stop the inevitable. Tiana's breath caught in her throat as the room seemed to constrict around her. The shadows deepened, swirling like a storm just beyond her reach. The energy within her pulsed again, stronger this time, like a rhythmic thumping in her chest. It was as if she could feel the very air vibrating with power. She glanced at Max, who was still standing firm, his eyes locked on the cloaked figures. Max stepped forward, his movements sharp and calculated, but Tiana's hand shot out to stop him. She could feel it, the strange force within her that was trying to break free. She had always been afraid of what was inside her, afraid of how different she was, how little she understood. But now she wasn't so sure that fear was enough to hold her back. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to ground herself, to listen to the strange pulse in her veins. It was more than just a feeling, it was a force. It was like her senses had heightened to an impossible degree, and with that awareness, something inside her shifted. A spark ignited in her chest. Tiana took a deep breath, feeling the energy surge within her. She could almost hear the hum of the world around her, a sound that wasn't quite physical but felt like it was resonating from within the earth itself. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about embracing whatever had awakened inside her. I don't know who you are or what you want, Tiana said, her voice low but full of new power. But I'm not your pawn. I'm not going to follow some path you've set for me. I'll make my own path. Her words hung in the air, charged with energy. And then, without warning, the power inside her burst forward. A pulse of light shot from her chest, so bright that it seemed to shatter the darkness of the room. The cloaked figures recoiled, their hands raised to shield their eyes from the blinding light. Max barked once more, his voice a sharp call to action. Tiana felt the energy enveloping her, radiating outwards like a shield. She had no control over it, but she knew one thing, this was her moment. The storm had not just been unleashed around her. It had awakened inside her. And there was no turning back. The pulse of energy that had erupted from Tiana felt like an explosion, raw, untamed, and unstoppable. She could feel it crackling in the air around her, rippling like a wave against the very fabric of reality. The room, which had been dimly lit by the flickering lights and the shadowy cloaks of the figures, now seemed to shimmer with an intensity she had never experienced before. Every inch of her skin felt alive with this newfound power. The cloaked figures staggered back, their hands raised instinctively to shield their eyes from the blinding light. Even Max, standing protectively in front of her, seemed startled by the force that surged from Tiana. His hackles remained raised, but there was a shift in his expression. He had never felt this kind of energy from her before. What is this? The tall man's voice broke through the crackling tension in the air. His expression, once confident, was now marred by a mixture of awe and fear. Tiana's breath came in ragged gasps, but the light didn't fade. It wrapped around her like a protective shield, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. It was like nothing she had ever felt. She could feel it coursing through her veins, like a river of fire, and she knew it was coming from somewhere deep inside her, something primal. Something ancient. The woman in black, who had been watching silently, now stepped forward, her face a mask of determination. She was unfazed by the blinding light, her hands trembling slightly. You've unlocked it. There was a trace of disbelief in her voice, but it was mixed with something else, something almost impressed. This power, this force within you, it's not just the power of the bloodline. It's something else. Tiana could feel the tension in the room, the weight of their words settling in. She didn't know what they meant, but she knew one thing for certain now, this wasn't normal. This wasn't just about being different. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was something else entirely. The tall man took a step back, his eyes widening. Impossible. No one has awakened the true power of the bloodline. Not in centuries. His voice faltered, and the air seemed to thicken with his unease. It's too much. No one should have this kind of power. This is wrong. Tiana felt the surge of energy grow stronger, her hands trembling at her sides as if they had a life of their own. She had no control over it, no understanding of how to stop it, and yet it felt strangely natural, like it had always been meant to be part of her. The woman in black looked at her with a mixture of wariness and respect. You don't understand what you've done, child. The balance that has kept this world in check is fragile. I don't care about your balance. Tiana's voice was stronger than she had ever imagined, a resonance she could feel deep in her chest. You want me to be part of your plan, but I'm not a tool. I'm not a puppet. Max barked once more, his eyes glowing with an intensity that matched the growing energy in the room. He sensed that this was just the beginning, and he was ready to fight. He wasn't going to let anyone take Tiana from him, not without a battle. The cloaked figures recoiled at Tiana's outburst, their fear mounting. The tall man glanced at the others, his eyes narrowing in calculation. We have no choice now, he muttered. We must stop her before it's too late. Before Tiana could react, the figures began to move with swift, synchronized precision. One of them, the woman in black, raised her hands, a dark energy beginning to form around her fingertips. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of her intent, and Tiana felt a chill run down her spine. This woman had been part of this plan for far too long. She wasn't going to back down easily. Max's growl deepened, his stance widening as he prepared for whatever came next. His fur bristled with anticipation, and his eyes locked onto the woman in black. No, Tiana said through clenched teeth, her voice rising as the pulse of energy inside her surged. I won't let you do this. The woman in black's lips curled into a smile, though it was not one of kindness. You think you can control it? You think you can control what's awakening inside you? Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was enough to send a shiver through Tiana's entire being. You're not ready for what's to come. You can't fight fate, child. Tiana's eyes blazed, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She could feel the energy boiling inside her, rising to the surface in a fury. She didn't know how, and she didn't know why, but she felt it. This wasn't just about her mother's legacy, her bloodline, or the figures that stood before her, it was about something deeper. Something that was hers to control, to protect, to wield. I'm not afraid of you, Tiana said, her voice unwavering. The woman in black took another step toward her, but before she could act, the energy within Tiana exploded outward, a burst of light and sound that sent a shockwave through the room. The cloaked figures staggered back, but this time, Tiana wasn't focused on them. She was focused on herself. She could feel the pulse of energy rising within her, as if it was a living thing, something that could think, feel, and act on its own. The force wasn't just tied to her bloodline, it was tied to her very essence, to everything she was. And then, in an instant, the room fell silent. Tiana's heart raced as she stood, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The light had faded, but the energy remained, a hum in the air, a presence she could no longer ignore. Max, sensing the shift, trotted to her side, his body still tense but calm now, as though he understood what had just happened. He nuzzled her side, his eyes meeting hers as if offering his silent support. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. The tall man finally spoke again, his voice filled with both awe and frustration. What have you done? He whispered. You've broken the balance. You've unleashed something we cannot control. Tiana looked at him with newfound clarity. No. I've taken control. I'm done letting others decide my fate. The air around them was still heavy, thick with the aftermath of her awakening. The figures stood around her, warily watching her every move. The woman in black's face was a mask of frustration, but there was a flicker of respect in her eyes, something Tiana hadn't expected. "You think you can fight destiny?" the tall man asked again, his voice dark with menace. Tiana straightened, her gaze hardening. "I don't believe in destiny. I make my own path." The world felt different now, heavier, like a storm had passed and left in its wake a strange calm. But Tiana knew this was just the beginning. She had no idea what would come next or what the future held. But she had taken the first step toward her true self. And nothing would ever be the same again. Tiana's heart pounded in her chest as the cloaked figures regrouped. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with the weight of their expectations, their uncertainty. The power inside her was still there, humming just beneath her skin, but now she had to figure out what to do with it. She had acted instinctively, driven by fear and the desperate need to protect herself, but now the consequences were real. The tall man, still recovering from the shock of the blast, shot a venomous look toward Tiana. His breath came in ragged bursts, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've sealed your fate, girl. You think you've won. You don't even know what you've just unleashed. There are forces at play here that are older than you can comprehend." Tiana stood her ground, the burning energy inside her still swirling, waiting for her command. She could feel the tension in the air, the way everything seemed to be teetering on the edge of something. Her breath steadied, and Max growled low at her side, his eyes narrowed and alert. "I don't know what I've unleashed, but I'm not afraid of it," Tiana replied, her voice firm despite the confusion swirling inside her. "Whatever this power is, it's mine. And I will learn how to control it." The woman in black, her face unreadable, looked toward the tall man, then back at Tiana. There was a moment of silence before she spoke, her tone calmer than before. "You think you can control it, but the truth is, it's already out of control. You've tapped into something primal, something that can't be tamed. You don't understand what you're dealing with, child." The tall man stepped forward, a slow, deliberate movement. "There are consequences for this kind of arrogance. The balance is already shifting, and once it's gone, there's no going back. You've stirred something that should have remained dormant." Tiana's pulse quickened. The balance. It seemed to be the key to everything they were saying, but what did it even mean? She had no answers, only questions. She glanced at Max, who was still poised to act, his instincts never wavering. "What balance?" she asked, her voice edged with frustration. "What are you talking about?" The woman in black's eyes softened just slightly, her expression flickering with something that might have been sympathy, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. She crossed her arms, looking down at the ground for a moment before speaking again. "There are forces in this world, ancient powers, that keep everything in check. Forces that balance light and dark, good and evil. Powers like yours, like the one awakening inside you, can tip that balance. And once that happens, there's no going back. Chaos will follow." Tiana tried to process the words, but they were too vague, too cryptic. She had spent her whole life not understanding the strange things she felt inside her, and now it seemed the answers she sought were buried in riddles and half-truths. She didn't know what was real or what was simply a manipulation. But one thing was certain, whatever power she had awakened, it was part of her now. "I'm not going to let anyone control me," Tiana said again, more resolute this time. "I'll find my own way, my own path." The tall man sneered, shaking his head. "Foolish child. You have no idea what you're up against." Max's growl deepened, and the tension in the room escalated. The air felt thick, as if something was building. Tiana could feel it in the pit of her stomach, something ominous, like the calm before a storm. "Your arrogance is your downfall," the woman in black said, her eyes narrowing. "The truth is, the forces that you've awakened, they're not yours to control. They belong to the unseen hand. And the unseen hand does not forgive. Tiana blinked. The unseen hand? What is that? The woman in black smiled coldly, a humorless expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's not something you need to know just yet, but you will. They are the ones who keep the balance. They are the ones who will come for you if you don't learn to control this power. The tall man stepped forward again, his hand tightening into a fist. The unseen hand has been watching you, Tiana. And now that you've broken the seal, they'll be coming. You'll never escape them. They control everything. Tiana felt a chill run down her spine. The unseen hand. She had never heard of them, but there was an unmistakable weight to the name, as though it carried a sense of inevitability. The power that had awakened in her was more than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about her bloodline. It was something deeper, more dangerous, and something she wasn't prepared for. Max's body tensed, his gaze darting between the figures and Tiana. It was clear he understood the danger, even if she didn't. The loyalty in his eyes was unwavering, but the uncertainty was there too. He was scared, not of her, but of the forces they were facing. You say I've broken the balance, Tiana said, her voice shaking only slightly, but I won't let anyone control me. I'll fight back. I will control my destiny. The woman in black shook her head. It's not about control. It's about survival. You've made your choice, Tiana. And now, the real battle begins. The tall man's lips curled into a snarl. The unseen hand will not be swayed by your defiance. They will come for you, and when they do, no one, will be able to protect you. Tiana's eyes blazed. I'm not afraid. The woman in black's expression softened for a moment, just a flicker of something that looked almost like pity. You will be. You will be. Without warning, the cloaked figures turned and began to fade into the shadows, retreating as swiftly and silently as they had appeared. The room, which had been charged with electricity just moments before, now felt eerily quiet, as if the threat had dissipated. But Tiana knew better. This was only the beginning. She could still feel the energy coursing through her, still feel the weight of the power that had been awakened inside her. The unseen hand, it didn't matter how many threats they made. She would find a way to understand this power. She would find a way to survive. Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He wasn't afraid either, not of her, not of the shadows, not of the future. Together, they would face whatever came next. But Tiana knew that the Real challenge was only just beginning. And whatever the unseen hand was, whatever force had awakened inside her, it wasn't something she could outrun. It was something she would have to face head-on. And she would be ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Tiana stood in the silence that followed the departure of the cloaked figures, her mind racing. The air felt heavier than it had ever been before, suffocating with uncertainty and the growing presence of something far more dangerous than she had imagined. The energy inside her still pulsed, but it wasn't the comfort she had hoped for. It felt like a ticking clock, each beat signaling that time was running out. Max stood by her side, his fur bristling, every fiber of his being alert. His tail was stiff, his ears angled back. He could sense it too, something beyond their control. The unseen hand. The words echoed in her mind like a distant drumbeat. She couldn't shake the image of the cloaked figures' departing faces, the warning that had been delivered with so much certainty. They hadn't just come to intimidate her. They had come to prepare her for something far worse. The woman in black had said it, Tiana had broken something. But was it something she could fix? Or was she now just a pawn in a game played by forces far beyond her understanding? Tiana took a deep breath, her fingers pressing into her palms. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this room a few hours ago. She had felt something ancient stir inside her, and with it came the awareness that her life had changed forever. There was no going back now. "Max," she whispered, crouching down to his level. His warm brown eyes met hers, steady and strong. "We need to get out of here. There's nothing left for us here." Max let out a low whine in agreement, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for any lingering threats. Tiana could feel the weight of his gaze, the understanding between them that words couldn't explain. They both knew they couldn't stay here. Not with the unseen hand hunting her down. Not with whatever was awakening inside her, pulling her deeper into a world she didn't belong to. But where would they go? Tiana stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, the decision solidifying in her mind. There was no safe place. But she could run. She could find out what was going on, what had happened to her mother, and why she had been chosen for this, whatever this was. And she would do it on her own terms. She turned and began walking toward the exit, her steps slow but purposeful. Max followed closely behind, never more than a few inches away. She knew he would protect her, just as he always had. The cold night air greeted her as she stepped outside, the quiet city streets stretched out before her. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the coolness of the air settle on her skin. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling with an eerie calmness. It was almost as if the world were holding its breath. Tiana closed her eyes, breathing deeply. There had to be something she could do. There had to be some clue she was missing. Everything felt like a puzzle, each piece slipping just out of her reach, but she couldn't stop now. If she did, the consequences would be too dire. The unseen hand was out there, watching, waiting. And she needed answers. "Where do we go now, girl?" she muttered to Max, her voice breaking the stillness. He let out a soft whine, his head tilting slightly as if considering her question. Then, without hesitation, he padded forward, leading her down the street. It didn't matter where they went. They had to move, and fast. But part of her couldn't help feeling the weight of what was coming. They were being hunted. And she had no idea how to stop it. The next few days blurred into one long, restless stretch of travel. Tiana and Max made their way across the country, moving from city to city, never staying in one place too long. Each time they settled somewhere, Tiana felt a nagging sensation in the pit of her stomach, as if the walls around her were closing in. She couldn't escape the feeling that the unseen hand was getting closer. She spent her nights scouring libraries, searching for anything that might shed light on the strange power inside her. She needed answers, and fast. There had to be something, some old book, some forgotten legend, that could explain what she had awakened. But nothing came. The more she searched, the more the mystery deepened. The power inside her was unlike anything she had ever read about. There were no ancient texts or dusty scrolls that offered clarity. It was as though it had never existed in the records of time. Tiana sat at a table in a small cafe in a sleepy town on the outskirts of a large city, her eyes scanning a thick, ancient book she had borrowed from a local library. Max lay under the table, his eyes closed, resting but still alert. Her fingers drummed impatiently against the pages. The silence was broken by the jingle of the doorbell above the entrance to the cafe as it swung open. A man stepped inside, wearing a well-tailored suit, his dark sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. He was tall, with sharp features, his every movement deliberate. But what stood out most to Tiana was the strange energy that seemed to follow him, like a shadow lingering at the edges of the room. Max's head jerked up, his ears flicking as he growled low under his breath. The man's gaze locked onto Tiana, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Tiana's heart raced. She didn't know who he was, but something told her that this man wasn't just a random passerby. There was an intensity in his eyes, a knowing that made her skin crawl. The man's lips curled into a half-smile, and he took a step toward her. "Tiana," he said, his voice smooth and calm, yet carrying a weight that seemed to press against her chest. "I've been looking for you." Max stood, hackles raised, ready to spring at any moment. Tiana's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. Instead, she stared back at him, trying to decipher who this man was and why he was here. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady, even though her mind was racing. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, ready to defend herself. The man's smile widened. "I'm someone who understands what you've awakened. And I think it's time you learned the truth about the power inside you." Tiana's heart skipped a beat. He knew. But how? And what did he mean by the truth? "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing," she said, trying to sound confident even though every instinct inside her screamed to run. The man leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "This isn't a game, Tiana. You've opened a door, and now, you have no choice but to walk through it. The unseen hand has already noticed you. They'll be coming soon. And when they do, you'll wish you had listened to me." Tiana's breath caught in her throat. Her worst fear was coming to life. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, barely able to make her voice heard over the growing dread. Tiana's mind raced as the man's words echoed through her, each syllable laced with an eerie certainty. The unseen hand. The words felt like a cold gust of wind, sharp and biting, as they twisted in her mind. "They'll be coming soon." Max's low growl intensified, his body tense with an unease that Tiana could feel right down to her bones. The man standing in front of her, so calm, so composed, was the very image of danger, yet there was something else about him that felt almost familiar. A sharp, unsettling familiarity. Tiana met his gaze, her heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" she repeated, this time with more conviction, her voice steadier despite the terror that was beginning to take root. The man's smile softened, but there was no warmth in it. Instead, it was like the smile of someone who knew far too much. "I'm not here to hurt you, Tiana. I'm here to help you understand what you've gotten yourself into." She narrowed her eyes. "Help me? By scaring me half to death." His eyes gleamed with a knowing amusement, as if he were watching some sort of grand performance unfold. "You have no idea how much worse it could get. The unseen hand won't hesitate to tear through anything, or anyone, that stands in their way. And you, my dear, are standing directly in their path." Tiana felt a chill settle over her. She stood up from the table slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the chair. "I don't need your help. I'll find a way to handle this on my own." The man didn't move, but his expression darkened. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The power inside you, it's not just some gift you can control with willpower. It's an ancient force, one that has been dormant for centuries. And now that it's awake, you're no longer in control. You're a pawn in a game that's far bigger than you. The unseen hand has already marked you. And if you don't learn how to use it, they'll come for you." Tiana's pulse quickened. Every word felt like a heavy weight pushing down on her chest. "Then what am I supposed to do? Let you take me under your wing and turn me into some pawn of yours?" The man's eyes softened, though there was no sympathy in them. "No. But you need to understand that you have very few choices left. Either you accept the truth and learn how to fight back, or you let the forces that have awakened inside you destroy everything you care about." Max growled again, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Tiana reached down to pet him, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She could feel his anxiety mirroring her own. Tiana took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Who are you, really?" The man's gaze hardened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am someone who has seen what the unseen hand is capable of. And I've seen what they'll do if you don't learn how to control what's inside you. You think you're the only one with this power? You're not. There are others like you, others who have awakened their abilities. But they don't know what they're dealing with either." Tiana's heart skipped a beat. "Others? How many?" His lips tightened. Enough to form an army. An army that the unseen hand would do anything to crush before it can rise up. An army? Tiana's mind whirled. It felt like the ground beneath her feet was shifting. What does all of this have to do with me? The man straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. You're the key, Tiana. The force inside you, it's not just some random power. It's the heart of an ancient conflict. The unseen hand wants to control it, use it to reshape the world in their image. But you can stop them. You have the potential to destroy them, if you learn how to harness what you've awakened. Tiana stepped back, her breath shallow. The man's words were like a tidal wave, threatening to drown her. She had always known she was different, had always felt like she was standing on the edge of something far larger than herself, but this? This was something entirely different. Something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Why me? She whispered, barely able to voice the question. Why is it me they want? The man's expression softened for just a moment, a flicker of something like regret passing across his face. Because you have the power to change everything. The power to tip the scales in favor of light or darkness. You have the choice, Tiana. But you have to make it soon. Her mind spun with 1,000 questions, none of which she could answer. What was this power inside her? Why had it chosen her? And why had her mother kept it a secret? Before she could process the flood of thoughts, the man spoke again, his voice now lower, more urgent. You need to come with me. We don't have much time. The unseen hand's agents are already closing in on you. If we don't act now, you won't survive. Max's growl deepened, but Tiana held her hand up to calm him. The urgency in the man's voice was impossible to ignore. And yet, something about him still didn't sit right. She didn't trust him, but the reality of the situation was clear. Time was running out. She met his gaze, her heart pounding. Fine. I'll go with you. But know this, I'm not doing this because I trust you. I'm doing it because I have no choice. The man nodded, his face inscrutable. That's all I can ask for. Tiana hesitated, glancing one last time at the cafe around her. For the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, she felt the full weight of what was happening. The path ahead wasn't just unknown, it was a dark abyss, filled with dangers she could barely fathom. But she couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. If she wanted to survive, she had to step into the light, no matter how blinding it was. Let's go, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. The man turned without another word, heading toward the door. Max followed her lead, staying close as they stepped into the cold night air. The world around them seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin tingle, as though it knew something was changing. Tiana didn't know what awaited her, but she knew one thing for certain, she was no longer in control of her own fate. The unseen hand was coming. And whatever truths the man in front of her had, they were the key to surviving what was to come. With a deep breath, Tiana took the first step into the unknown, the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders. Tiana walked briskly beside the man, her heart pounding in her chest. The night air felt colder now, each step she took further away from the small cafe she had spent the last few hours in, her sanctuary turned battlefield. She could still feel Max's presence beside her, his silent protection giving her a sense of comfort, but the weight of the man's words hung in the air like a dense fog. The unseen hand. An army. Power beyond anything she had ever imagined. She glanced at the man who walked ahead of her. He hadn't spoken since they left the cafe, but his posture, straight, purposeful, spoke volumes. He exuded an aura of authority, a quiet confidence that made it hard to gauge whether he was a friend, an ally, or simply another dangerous player in this twisted game. For now, Tiana decided, he was the only person who might have the answers she so desperately needed. But that didn't mean she trusted him. They made their way down darkened streets, the city around them deserted at this hour. The street seemed to blur in the dim glow of streetlights, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps the only sound in the night. Tiana couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she saw no one. It was the kind of feeling you get when someone is standing just out of sight, their eyes trained on you, but the shadows kept them hidden. Max, sensing her anxiety, stayed close. He kept his eyes darting to every corner, every alleyway they passed, his instinct as sharp as ever. Tiana reached down and scratched behind his ears, seeking some reassurance from him. His presence calmed her, just as it always had. She could hear his breathing, a steady, rhythmic sound that anchored her to the present moment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man stopped in front of a tall, nondescript building. It was an old structure, seemingly forgotten by time. Its brick exterior was weathered, the windows dark and uninviting. The sign in front of it had long since fallen off, and the door was a single piece of aged wood, painted black but now chipped and peeling. Tiana hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot. "This is where we're going?" she asked, her voice wary. The man didn't look back as he pulled open the door. "This is where you'll learn what you need to know," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tiana swallowed her fear and stepped forward, Max right beside her. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched ahead of them. The faint sound of murmured voices echoed from deep within the building, the low hum of distant conversations that faded as soon as the door clicked shut behind them. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and age. The walls were lined with shelves full of books, old, tattered books, and various strange artifacts. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, making the place feel even more like a hidden lair than a safe house. Tiana's gaze swept over the room, but she was immediately drawn to a large wooden table at the center, where a man and a woman were already seated. The woman was older, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, while the man beside her was younger, with sharp features and dark, almost haunted eyes. Both were watching Tiana intently, as though expecting her. Without a word, the man who had brought her here stepped forward, addressing them. "We need to talk." Tiana's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating. She had no idea who these people were or what role they played in the larger scheme, but it was clear that they were part of something far bigger than her. The older woman gave a small nod, her gaze never leaving Tiana. "You've made the right choice, child," she said, her voice soft but commanding. Tiana stiffened at the word child, but before she could respond, the younger man stood up and walked over to her. His gaze was intense, studying her with an almost clinical curiosity. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low. "You're more important than you realize." Max let out a low growl at the man's approach, and Tiana placed a calming hand on his back. "I don't know who you people are, but I didn't come here for riddles. I need answers." The older woman smiled faintly, then gestured for Tiana to sit. "Sit, dear. You'll understand soon enough." Reluctantly, Tiana took a seat at the table, her eyes darting to the man who had brought her here. He remained standing near the door, watching her silently. She felt like a pawn in some chess game, being moved without ever having a say in the direction of her own life. The older woman spoke again, her voice calm but with an underlying force. "We know you've awakened something inside you. A power that's long been dormant. But there's more to it than that. Much more. You've been chosen, Tiana. Chosen by forces far older than you can imagine." Tiana felt her heart skip a beat. Chosen? For what? The younger man's dark eyes gleamed as he leaned in. For a purpose. You're not the only one who has this power, but you are the one who can end this conflict once and for all. "And what conflict?" Tiana asked, her voice sharp. "What are you talking about?" The older woman looked at the younger man before speaking again, her gaze steady. "The unseen hand is not just a name. It's a shadow organization that has manipulated events for centuries. They've controlled the flow of power, both magical and political, for as long as humanity has existed. But now, they're after something greater than mere control, they want absolute dominance. And you, Tiana, are the key to stopping them. Tiana's head spun with the weight of her words. But I don't know anything about any of this. I don't even understand the power inside me. The younger man nodded, his gaze softening, though his words were firm. You will. But first, you need to understand that this is bigger than you or me. The unseen hand will not stop until they have what they want. And if they succeed, everything will change. The world as you know it will fall into chaos. Tiana's stomach twisted with the magnitude of what she was hearing. It felt impossible, like something out of a nightmare. Yet, there was an undeniable truth in their words. She had already felt the power within her, the strange energy that was stirring, growing stronger with each passing day. Max shifted beside her, his gaze flicking to the door as if something had caught his attention. The room felt suddenly colder, and a chill crept up Tiana's spine. The older woman leaned forward, her voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. The unseen hand will stop at nothing to destroy you, Tiana. And if you don't learn how to control this power, you will be their greatest weapon, something to be wielded, not someone to be protected. Tiana stood, her mind racing. So, what now? What do I need to do? The younger man rose to his feet, stepping closer. Now, we train you. We help you harness your power, teach you how to defend yourself, how to fight. The unseen hand is coming for you, and when they do, you need to be ready. Tiana's eyes flicked to the man who had brought her here. He nodded, his expression unreadable. You won't be alone. We'll guide you, but the rest is up to you. It's time for you to embrace who you are. Her heart beat faster. There was no going back now. The power inside her had awakened, and with it came a responsibility she wasn't ready for. But there was no choice. She had to learn. She had to fight. For the first time, Tiana felt a flicker of something deep inside her, a spark of determination. She was ready to face what was coming. The room was silent, save for the steady flicker of the candles and the soft shuffle of Max's paws against the floor. Tiana sat at the old wooden table, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and determination. Every word she had heard since stepping through the door echoed in her head, each one pulling her deeper into a world she never asked to be a part of. The older woman, whose name Tiana had yet to learn, rose from her seat with an air of calm authority. Her graying hair framed her face like a silver halo, and her eyes, though soft, carried the weight of years spent in quiet preparation. You've already sensed the power, Tiana, she began, her voice as steady as ever. You may not fully understand it yet, but you must learn to. What you're about to face is unlike anything you've ever known. The unseen hand is not just an enemy you can defeat with strength alone. It's a force that manipulates minds, controls events, and twists reality itself. You will need more than raw power to survive. Tiana swallowed hard, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and resolve. She had always known there was something different about her, but to hear it from these strangers, the weight of the truth about her power, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between the pull of the unknown and the safety of the familiar. You're right, Tiana said softly, trying to steady her voice. I don't understand any of this. But I know you're right. I don't have a choice anymore. I need to learn. The older woman gave a small nod, her eyes filled with understanding. You'll learn quickly, but it won't be easy. Power like yours doesn't just sit idle, it pushes, it demands. And if you're not careful, it will consume you. Tiana looked down at her hands. The power was there, she could feel it like a restless, pulsing energy deep inside her. It scared her. But there was something else, too, something that sparked a flicker of hope. The idea that she could control it, could use it for something greater than herself, was both terrifying and exhilarating. The younger man, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking the intensity behind his words. The first thing you need to understand is that control is not just about willpower. It's about connection. You have to connect with the power within you, understand its nature, and form a bond with it. Tiana looked up at him, confusion still clouding her thoughts. Connect with it? How? He stepped forward, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Through focus. Through trust. You can't just summon the power like a weapon, at least, not in the way you might think. It's like a living thing, a force that responds to you, to your emotions, your desires. If you approach it with fear, it will feed on that fear. But if you embrace it, if you learn to respect it, you will find a balance. That's the first step. Tiana's breath caught in her throat. Fear. You mean I have to control it? The man nodded, his gaze steady. Fear is the enemy of control. If you allow it to dominate you, you will be overwhelmed. The power you carry is not evil, but it can be twisted. You must learn to wield it, or it will wield you. The older woman stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Tiana's shoulder. This is where we start. The first lesson isn't about fighting or using power. It's about understanding your own mind. You need to learn to quiet it, to silence the doubts, the fears, the distractions. Only then can you begin to feel the true nature of your power. Tiana's heart raced. How do I do that? Sit with us, the older woman said, her voice soothing. Close your eyes. Focus on your breath. Focus on the present. And let everything else fall away. Reluctantly, Tiana closed her eyes. She had never been good at meditation or stillness, her mind was always racing, always filled with 100 different thoughts, each one pulling her in a different direction. But tonight, she needed to try. She needed to find that focus. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, trying to center herself. The room around her seemed to fade away, and for a brief moment, she felt a flicker of calm. Her thoughts slowed, her heartbeats becoming steady and rhythmic. She felt the presence of Max beside her, the quiet energy of the room, but most of all, she felt the power inside her. It was there, in the back of her mind, restless, like a coiled spring, waiting for her to reach out to it. A wave of unease washed over her, and she almost opened her eyes. But then she remembered the man's words, fear would break her connection. She took another deep breath, pushing the doubt aside, and reached for that inner presence, that energy. At first, it was a faint feeling, like a whisper on the edge of her consciousness. But as she focused, it grew stronger. A warmth spread through her chest, and she could feel the power inside her, pulsing in time with her breath. It was unlike anything she had ever felt, like an electric current running through her veins. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet. But it was undeniable. It was real. Slowly, she opened her eyes, a sense of quiet pride swelling inside her. She had touched it. For the first time, she had connected with it. The older woman smiled, a look of approval in her eyes. Well done, Tiana. The first step is always the hardest. Now, we move to the next phase. The younger man spoke, his voice calm but firm. Now you need to learn to channel it. You must learn to direct that power, to shape it into something useful. Tiana nodded, still processing what had just happened. But her mind was racing, now with anticipation. She had done it once. She could do it again. And this time, it wouldn't just be about connecting, it would be about controlling, shaping, and ultimately using it. Let's begin, Tiana said, the determination in her voice clear. The training had just begun, and already, she could feel the weight of her destiny settling onto her shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but Tiana knew one thing for sure, she was ready. She had to be. The unseen hand was coming. And she would be prepared. The first few days of training were grueling, more demanding than anything Tiana had ever experienced. She had thought herself prepared for the challenge, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of what she was being asked to do. Each morning, Tiana woke before dawn, greeted by the sight of the candles flickering dimly in the cold room. She was learning to push her limits, both physically and mentally, and the lessons came fast and hard. But the most exhausting part wasn't the grueling physical exercises or the exhausting mental focus, it was the emotional toll of it all. Her mind was constantly under siege. As she worked to harness her power, she had to confront fears and doubts that she had spent her entire life burying. The deeper she delved into her training, the more she realized how much she had been running from her own potential, how much she had been afraid to face the truth of who she was. The older woman, who had introduced herself as Serafina, was her primary instructor. She pushed Tiana beyond her limits, urging her to confront the power that swirled inside her like a storm. "You have to stop running from it, Tiana," Serafina would say, her voice steady but unyielding. "Your power is not something to fear. It is part of you." At first, Tiana had resisted. The thought of embracing the power felt like inviting chaos into her life. But as the days wore on, something inside her began to shift. The energy that once felt foreign now pulsed with a kind of recognition, like an old friend returning after a long absence. It was hers. It was always hers. But power alone wasn't enough. Serafina made it clear that Tiana needed to learn to control it, not just wield it. The exercises grew more complex. In the mornings, Tiana would practice meditation and mental exercises to sharpen her focus, clearing her mind of distractions. During these sessions, she could feel the power within her moving in response to her thoughts. Sometimes, it would swirl like wind in a storm, pulling at her, tempting her to give in to its force. Other times, it would quiet down, as if waiting for her to issue a command. In the afternoons, the training turned physical. Max was always by her side, providing comfort and protection, his presence a steady reminder of the strength she had within her. The younger man, whose name was Elias, joined them for these sessions, teaching her how to move, how to defend herself, how to harness her power in the heat of battle. Elias was a master of hand-to-hand combat, his movements fluid and precise. He had a quiet confidence, a kind of silent assurance that made it clear he had seen more than his fair share of danger. His eyes, sharp and calculating, never missed a movement, and his hands were like lightning, quick, deadly, and always in control. "You have to learn to fight," Elias told her one afternoon as they practiced in the courtyard outside the building. "It's not enough to just have power. Power alone will get you killed if you don't know how to protect yourself, how to fight back. The unseen hand doesn't play fair. They will use everything at their disposal." Tiana was struggling to keep up with him, sweat dripping down her face as she attempted to block his blows. Her body was aching, but she refused to show weakness. She couldn't afford to. "You're too hesitant," Elias remarked, his voice calm but firm. "Power is not a passive force. It's not something you wait for. It's something you take, something you command. Do you understand?" Tiana nodded, her breath ragged. She understood more than he realized. She wasn't just learning to fight. She was learning to stop being afraid. The days blurred together, the line between exhaustion and achievement growing thinner with each passing moment. But despite the grueling nature of her training, Tiana felt a sense of purpose growing inside her. She wasn't just training to defend herself. She was training to protect the people she loved, to stop the unseen hand from destroying everything she held dear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the courtyard, Serafina called Tiana to the center. Max was at her side, his coat gleaming in the low light. "Tonight is a turning point," Serafina said, her tone serious. "Tonight, we'll begin to push your limits further. We'll see how well you've connected with the power inside you." Tiana stood tall, her hands clenched by her sides. The weight of the moment settled in her chest. She was ready for this. She had to be. Serafina raised her hands, and the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. Focus, she instructed. Draw from the power within. Let it rise up, let it surge. Don't hold back. But remember, you must control it. You cannot let it control you. Tiana closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She reached inside herself, feeling for that familiar pulse of energy. It was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be called upon. She stretched out her senses, willing the power to respond, willing it to come to her like a wave rising from the depths. At first, nothing happened. Her thoughts wavered, and the power seemed to retreat, as though testing her resolve. But Tiana didn't falter. She had been practicing for this moment, and she wasn't about to give up now. She dug deeper. Her mind sharpened, and she could feel the energy within her responding, growing stronger, clearer. The sensation was like a river breaking through a dam, forceful but controlled. The power rose within her, swirling around her limbs, filling the space like a living force. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the power surged. Tiana's body shuddered with the intensity of it, but she held steady. The air grew thick, and a sudden gust of wind whipped around her, sending her hair flying. The light from the candles flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze in place. Serafina's eyes gleamed with approval. Well done, Tiana. You've done it. Tiana opened her eyes, her chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. She felt the power swirling within her, still present but no longer overwhelming. It was hers to command, hers to shape. She had finally connected with it. Elias stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he observed her. That's a start. But we need more. You need to learn how to wield that power in combat. How to direct it in ways that will allow you to control the battlefield. Tiana nodded. She understood. This was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. But for the first time, she felt a sense of certainty. The power that had once terrified her now felt like a part of her. She wasn't just a passive observer of her fate anymore. She was in control. And the unseen hand didn't stand a chance. The days after Tiana's first true connection with her power were filled with intense focus and unyielding discipline. Every moment seemed to be designed to push her beyond her limits. Every lesson, every exercise, every interaction with Elias, Serafina, and even Max was meticulously structured to help her harness and control the power she now understood she couldn't ignore. But despite her training, Tiana felt an unease gnawing at her, a quiet voice in the back of her mind that whispered she wasn't ready. The knowledge of what was coming, what the unseen hand would bring to her door, haunted her. Even though she could feel the power inside her, she was still unsure of herself. She had the tools now, but did she truly know how to use them? The answer would soon come, far sooner than she expected. It was late afternoon when Serafina called her to the courtyard for what would be the first test of her abilities in a real, practical situation. Tiana had been running drills all morning with Elias, practicing everything from simple defense to more complicated attacks, but it was one thing to practice with controlled moves and another to face the unpredictable nature of real combat. Are you ready? Serafina asked as Tiana approached her, the older woman's voice sharp, as if she was already preparing for what was coming. I think so, Tiana replied, though her voice shook slightly with uncertainty. She had no idea what Serafina meant by the first test. Hadn't she already passed tests? Hadn't she already shown that she could wield the power within her? Serafina didn't answer her question. Instead, she nodded toward the distant trees at the edge of the property, where the shadows of the evening had already begun to stretch. Your test begins now. Tiana's eyes followed Serafina's gaze, narrowing as she saw movement in the distance. At first, she couldn't make it out. But then, as the figures grew closer, Tiana's heart stopped. A group of darkly dressed individuals appeared, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. They moved with purpose, and there was something unmistakably dangerous about the way they advanced. Tiana's breath caught in her throat as she realized what this was. This wasn't some practice drill. This was real. These were not mere attackers, but agents of the unseen hand. Serafina's voice rang out, sharp and calm. You must protect yourself and those around you. Max will defend you, but you must use your power. Tiana didn't have time to question anything further. Max growled beside her, his body tense, eyes trained on the approaching figures. She could feel the tension in the air, a heavy stillness that was quickly being replaced by the storm of impending action. The figures were close now, just a few yards away. One of them, taller than the others, stepped forward, lifting a hand. From beneath his cloak, a sharp, jagged blade gleamed in the fading sunlight. The others flanked him, surrounding Tiana and Max with silent precision. Step aside, girl, the tall figure said, his voice deep and chilling. This is not your fight. Tiana's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the power inside her stirring, like the deep, untamed energy of a storm about to break. I'm not moving, she said, her voice steady but with a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. And you'll regret thinking you could intimidate me. The leader of the group scoffed, and the others moved forward, their eyes gleaming with malice. Max growled again, his fur bristling as he stepped protectively in front of Tiana, his body low to the ground, ready to spring into action. Tiana's breath quickened. She didn't have time to hesitate. She reached inside herself, her mind laser-focused, calling on the power that surged within her. She didn't need to summon it, she realized. It was already there. She just had to let it flow, to direct it. Her hands shot out, and the air around her seemed to crackle with energy. She could feel the power swirling in response, as if it were a living thing waiting for her to take command. With a snap of her fingers, she directed it outward, a wave of force that slammed into the first attacker with enough force to knock him off his feet. The others stumbled back in shock, but Tiana didn't stop. She moved fluidly, her body now one with the power as she sent another blast of energy crashing into the nearest figure, sending him sprawling. Her heart raced, but she didn't let the fear creep in. The power she had connected with was now under her control. Max leaped forward at her side, his teeth bared, and the second attacker was thrown back as the dog barreled into him. The remaining two figures hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the fierce resistance Tiana was now presenting. Serafina's voice cut through the chaos. Focus, Tiana. You're doing well, but you must maintain control. This isn't about brute force. Direct your energy. Take them out. The words grounded her. She could feel the surge of power still pulsing through her, but now, she could direct it with purpose. She reached inward, pulling on the energy again, but this time with greater focus. She wasn't just throwing it out into the world. She was aiming it, guiding it with precision. The third attacker lunged at her, but she wasn't caught off guard. She twisted her body, summoning the power within her to shield herself. The energy surged around her like an invisible barrier, blocking the attack and sending the assailant flying backward. The last figure hesitated, eyeing her with suspicion. Tiana knew that he could sense her power, feel the danger that she now represented. He was no fool. But that hesitation gave her the opening she needed. She raised her hand, focusing all her energy into a single, controlled blast. The figure barely had time to react before the force of it sent him careening into the trees. When the fight was over, Tiana stood there, her chest heaving with adrenaline, Max beside her, growling low as the remaining figures retreated into the woods. Serafina stepped forward, her face unreadable. Well done. You've passed your first test. Tiana's knees wobbled, but she didn't allow herself to collapse. Not yet. She had done it. She had faced the threat head-on, and she had won. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. I did it, Tiana whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to herself or to the world around her. I really did it. Serafina's face softened for a moment. Yes, you did. But there is much more to come. You're still not ready. This was just a test, not the war you will have to fight. Tiana looked at the retreating shadows of the attackers. The fight was far from over. And she was just beginning to understand the weight of the battle ahead. This time, however, she wasn't just going to run. She was ready to face it, head on. The wind had shifted in the days following Tiana's first real test. While the victory felt like a triumph, the lingering sense of danger had not diminished. If anything, the close call with the unseen hands operatives made everything feel more urgent, more real. Tiana now knew the stakes were higher than ever before. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. She had seen the unseen hands' cold, ruthless efficiency, their willingness to do anything to achieve their goals. The attackers had come after her with a singular purpose, and they wouldn't stop. In fact, they were just getting started. Training resumed the next day, though with a new intensity. Tiana no longer had the luxury of just learning. She was now in the thick of things. There was no time for doubt. She had to grow stronger, faster, more capable. Every movement, every breath, was now a reminder of the responsibility she had taken on. The future was uncertain, but the only way forward was through. Serafina was relentless, pushing her harder than ever. They would train until Tiana's muscles screamed in protest, until her mind began to fragment under the strain of focus. But it was clear that this was no longer about strength alone. It was about something deeper, an inner resolve to never let the darkness win. Tiana's mind kept circling back to what had happened during the fight. She had felt the surge of power, and for the first time in her life, she hadn't feared it. But there was a part of her that still struggled with the unpredictability of it. The energy was a force she couldn't always fully control, and that terrified her. What if she lost control in the middle of the battle? What if it overwhelmed her? That night, as the moon rose high in the sky, Tiana sat alone in the courtyard, her mind racing. She had never felt more alive, and yet more vulnerable. The power inside her was undeniable, but it was also a constant, silent challenge. How long could she keep it under control? Max padded over to her side, as if sensing her unease. He nudged her with his nose, and she smiled faintly, reaching down to stroke his soft fur. His presence was grounding, a reminder of the bond between them that had carried her through so much already. "You've always been there for me, haven't you?" she whispered to him, her voice carrying in the still night. "I just hope I'm ready for what comes next. I don't want to fail." Max gave a soft bark, as though encouraging her, and that simple sound brought some peace to her swirling thoughts. She didn't have to face this alone. No one did. The next morning, Tiana was awakened before sunrise, her training resuming with renewed vigor. But this time, something felt different. There was a chill in the air that wasn't just from the cold of dawn. Tiana could feel it, a sense of unease, something more than just the normal tension of training. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. "Serafina," Tiana said as she approached the older woman. "What's wrong? Something feels off." Serafina's sharp gaze met hers, and for the first time, Tiana saw a flicker of concern in her eyes. "You're not wrong," she said, her voice grim. "We've received word. The unseen hand is making their move. They're targeting someone close to you." Tiana's heart sank. She knew exactly who that someone was. The thought of anyone else in danger because of her terrified her more than the prospect of facing the unseen hand head-on. "Who?" Tiana asked, her voice barely a whisper. Serafina's expression darkened. "Max. They know about him. They know he's more than just a dog to you." Tiana's pulse quickened. She had always known that Max was special, but she had never realized just how much attention they would attract because of him. Max wasn't just a dog. He was her protector, her companion, and now the enemy saw him as a potential threat. What do we do? Tiana asked, her mind racing. She wasn't about to let anything happen to Max. Not now, not ever. Serafina gave her a hard look, her tone firm. You stay focused. You trust your training, and you stay by Max's side. We can't let them get to him. If they think they can control him, or you, they're gravely mistaken. Max gave a low growl from where he sat beside Tiana, his ears pricked and alert. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening and was ready to protect her at all costs. Tiana stood up, determination flooding her veins. She wasn't about to let the unseen hand take anything from her, not again. They had already taken too much, and now, it was time to fight back. Serafina watched her for a moment, then nodded. There's one more thing. We've been preparing for a larger confrontation. The unseen hand has many layers, and we've only scratched the surface. The battle you've faced so far. It's nothing compared to what's coming. Tiana swallowed hard, her thoughts spinning. But she didn't have time for fear. There was no room for hesitation now. It was time to step into the role she had been training for, the role she had feared for so long. But no more running. Not now. Not ever again. Serafina handed her a small, intricate pendant. It was a symbol Tiana didn't recognize, a swirling design that seemed to shift ever so slightly as the light hit it. This will protect you, Serafina explained. It's an ancient relic. One of the few items the unseen hand cannot touch. Tiana took the pendant in her hand, feeling its weight. She didn't understand how it worked, but if Serafina believed in its power, that was enough for her. With the pendant in her palm, she felt the power surge within her once more. This time, it wasn't a chaotic flood. It was focused, controlled, ready. Max's bark broke through her thoughts. His protective instinct flared up, and he stood, ears forward, his gaze scanning the surrounding area. It's time, Tiana said, her voice steady. She was ready. For whatever came next, she was ready to face it, with Max by her side, and the power that flowed through her. They weren't just going to fight, they were going to win. The first light of dawn had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when Tiana and Max stood at the edge of the training grounds. The air was thick with anticipation, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the storm to break. Serafina had briefed her on the situation, the unseen hand was closing in, their reach now extending far beyond the shadows. Tiana knew that they would come for Max, and that meant it wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a matter of protecting what was hers, her companion, her strength. Tiana turned to Max, who was standing resolute beside her, his body tense and alert. His sharp, amber eyes never left her, and she could feel the bond between them, more intense than ever. They weren't just a girl and her dog, they were partners in this fight, and she knew he would give his life to protect her, as she would for him. I won't let them take you, Tiana whispered to him, more to herself than to him. The words felt like a vow, one that would carry her through whatever came next. Serafina stepped up beside her, the lines of her face hardening. We don't have the luxury of waiting. The unseen hand doesn't waste time. We'll need to move fast. Elias is scouting ahead to track their movements. He'll know where they are, but we can't let them get too close. Tiana nodded, her thoughts racing. What do I need to do? You stay close to Max, trust your instincts, and when the time comes, you use everything you've learned, Serafina instructed. Remember, the key isn't just fighting them off, it's keeping them away from you and Max. Control the battlefield. Control the power. The weight of the words settled heavily on Tiana's shoulders. She had spent days training, pushing her limits, and yet the reality of what lay ahead still felt too overwhelming. Could she really control the immense power inside her? Could she focus it, make it work for her instead of consuming her? Her gaze shifted to Max, who now sat beside her, his presence as steady as ever. The bond they shared wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, as if their souls had already decided that they were a team. She could feel his loyalty, his desire to protect, and the quiet power that flowed through him, just like the magic that ran through her veins. "We're in this together," she said softly, her voice more certain now. Max's tail gave a slight wag, as if to affirm her words. There was no going back. Suddenly, Elias appeared from the tree line, his dark eyes narrowed as he scanned the surroundings. He moved quickly, silently, like a shadow. "They're close," Elias said, his voice urgent. "We have to move now. They're tracking you." Tiana's heart raced as Serafina nodded sharply. "Stay sharp, both of you. Don't hesitate. They're going to try to overwhelm you. Trust yourself, and remember what you're fighting for." With that, the small group set off toward the thick forest that bordered the training grounds. The path was barely visible, hidden beneath layers of foliage and shadow. But Elias seemed to navigate the terrain with ease, his body shifting fluidly, his senses heightened. Tiana, on the other hand, kept close to Max, who trotted ahead, his ears flicking at every movement in the distance. As they advanced deeper into the woods, the tension in the air grew palpable. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant crack of a branch, had Tiana on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, stalked. The unseen hand had their eyes everywhere. Serafina's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll set up a perimeter here. Stay close." Tiana's breath caught as she turned to look at her surroundings. The dense trees and underbrush felt suffocating, as if the very earth was pressing in on them. But there was no time for hesitation. Tiana moved to a position where she could keep her eyes on all directions, her senses fully alert, ready for anything. Moments passed in tense silence, the air thick with the impending confrontation. Then, just as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, a noise broke the stillness, a sharp, unnatural rustling. Tiana's heart stopped. She could feel it now, the unseen hand was close. Elias stiffened, his eyes scanning the shadows. "They're here," he said, his voice low but firm. Tiana could feel her pulse quicken, the power within her awakening as if sensing the danger. She took a deep breath, reaching for that energy inside, ready to channel it. But she wasn't alone in this. Max growled softly, his fur bristling, and Tiana could see his body tense, every muscle prepared to spring into action. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. Their movement was fluid and synchronized, like a pack of predators, intent on their prey. Tiana's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, she raised her hand, focusing on the power that was now a part of her. It surged up from deep within her, and she directed it outward, her mind sharp as a blade. The first attacker lunged toward her, a dark figure with a glinting knife in hand. But Tiana was faster. She thrust her hand forward, and a wave of energy exploded from her fingertips, slamming into the assailant and sending him flying back into a tree. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious, but not dead. Max leaped forward with a snarl, his fangs bared as he took down another figure who had tried to flank Tiana. The two struggled briefly, but Max's strength was unmatched. In a swift motion, he incapacitated the attacker, his growl echoing in the clearing. The remaining three assailants hesitated for only a moment, realizing the danger they were in. One reached for a weapon, but Serafina was already moving, drawing a blade from her side and taking a defensive stance. Elias, too, had shifted into position, his body coiled and ready to strike. Tiana's breath was coming in quick bursts now. She could feel the pressure building, but she didn't hesitate. She called on the power again, this time with even greater control. The surge was stronger, more focused, as she sent a blast of energy straight toward the remaining attackers. The blast knocked two of them off their feet, sending them flying backward into the underbrush, momentarily stunned. But the last one, the leader, remained standing. His eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with anger. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. Tiana stood tall, her fists clenched, ready to face whatever came next. The battle wasn't over. But this time, she wasn't afraid. With Max by her side and her newfound power in hand, she was ready for whatever the unseen hand would throw at her. "Bring it on," she whispered under her breath. And in that moment, she knew, this was just the beginning of their fight. The air was thick with tension, every rustle in the trees, every shift in the wind seeming to carry with it the weight of a coming storm. Tiana stood at the center of the clearing, her body still humming with the power she had unleashed moments before. Max, ever vigilant, stood beside her, his fur bristling as he kept his eyes trained on the last assailant who remained standing. The figure in front of her, the leader of the unseen hand's attack force, didn't look afraid. He looked determined. "You have no idea what you're up against," he sneered, his voice low and threatening. His dark, piercing eyes never left Tiana, calculating, as though he were searching for a way to overcome her. He didn't know her. He didn't understand what she had become, what she was capable of. But that was about to change. Tiana clenched her fists, feeling the familiar surge of energy flare inside her once again. This wasn't just power, it was a part of her now. It had become as instinctual as breathing, a force she could shape, mold, and control. For a moment, she wondered if she would ever truly understand it. But there was no time for doubts now. She had a purpose. And that purpose was to protect those she loved. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse was racing. "But you're about to find out." Without another word, the leader lunged toward her, his movements fast and fluid. He was a trained fighter, no doubt about it. But Tiana was quicker, sharper, and she had learned to fight not just with her body but with her mind. She moved to the side just as he swiped a blade toward her, the glint of steel catching in the dimming light. Max was beside her in an instant, his teeth bared, a low growl emanating from his chest. He didn't need a command. He moved as though he and Tiana were one, partners in this battle, partners in life. With a swift motion, Max pounced, knocking the leader off balance. The attacker stumbled backward, giving Tiana the perfect opening. Drawing on the energy inside her, Tiana raised her hand, and a bolt of power shot toward the leader. He dodged, but just barely, and the blast struck a nearby tree, splintering it in half. The sound of cracking would echoed through the forest, but the leader's eyes were now filled with fury. "You're stronger than I expected," he said, his voice gritted with anger. "But it's not enough to save you." "Maybe," Tiana replied, her voice calm but filled with determination. "But it'll be enough to stop you." The leader didn't hesitate. He charged at her again, faster this time, his hand moving toward a hidden blade at his waist. But Tiana had already anticipated his move. As he closed the distance between them, she released another wave of energy. This time, she focused all of it into a single, concentrated blast. The force of it sent him tumbling backward, crashing into the ground with a heavy thud. Max barked once, his tail wagging slightly as he stood guard beside Tiana. The leader was down, but Tiana knew better than to let her guard down. He was still dangerous, still relentless. The figure slowly pushed himself up from the ground, his clothes torn, his face bruised. His eyes were filled with rage now, but there was something else there too, fear. Fear of what Tiana had become, of the power she had tapped into. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a force. And the unseen hand was learning that the hard way. "You think you've won?" the leader spat, blood trickling down his chin. "This isn't over. The hand will come for you, for your dog, for everything you care about. You'll never escape us." Tiana's heart tightened at his words. She had known the risks. She had always known. But now, standing before him, feeling the heat of her power pulsing through her veins, she wasn't afraid. The fear that had once haunted her had been replaced by something far stronger, resolve. "It's over," she said firmly, her gaze locking with his. "You're done." With that, Tiana raised her hand one last time, the energy flowing from her like a river breaking through a dam. This time, the blast was more controlled, more deliberate. It didn't just strike the leader, it surrounded him, wrapping around him like an unbreakable chain. He screamed, his body thrashing against the force, but it was futile. The energy was too strong, too unyielding. With a final, desperate gasp, the leader collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Tiana stood there for a moment, her chest heaving with the weight of what had just happened. She had fought with everything she had, her body, her mind, and her heart. And she had won. Max trotted over to her side, his soft eyes watching her with an almost knowing expression. He nuzzled her gently, as if asking if she was okay. Tiana smiled, her fingers running through his fur, the weight of the moment beginning to settle. "I'm fine, Max," she said quietly, though her voice was thick with emotion. "We're fine." Serafina and Elias emerged from the trees, their eyes scanning the area. Elias moved to the leader, checking for any signs of life. "He's out cold," Elias said, his voice sharp. "We'll take him back to headquarters. He'll talk." Serafina approached Tiana, her gaze steady but approving. "You did well," she said, her tone softening. "You've come far in such a short time." Tiana nodded, but the weight of it all pressed down on her. This battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The unseen hand was still out there, still watching, still waiting. "Thank you," Tiana said quietly, looking up at Serafina. "But I know this isn't the end." Serafina's expression hardened again. "No, it's just the beginning. The unseen hand is vast. But now, you're not alone. We have each other. And we'll keep fighting." Tiana looked at Max, his calm presence grounding her. She wasn't just a girl caught in a storm anymore. She was part of something bigger. And no matter what came next, she would face it, side by side with Max, Serafina, and Elias. Together, they would stop the unseen hand. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but Tiana was ready. Ready to fight. Ready to protect. Ready to be the force that stood between the darkness and the light. And she would never, ever stop fighting. The silence of the forest was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was a peace Tiana hadn't known for a long time, but it wasn't the kind of peace that allowed for rest, not yet, not after everything that had happened. She stood beside Max, her hand gently resting on his back as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and red. The leader of the unseen hand had been taken into custody, and though the immediate danger had passed, Tiana knew it wasn't over. The fight, the war, was far from done. But for the first time, she felt something within her, something stronger than the uncertainty and fear that had gripped her for so long. She had found her strength, and with it, a purpose. "I never thought we'd make it this far," Tiana said quietly, her voice almost lost in the breeze. She wasn't just speaking to Max. She was speaking to herself, too. Max turned his head to look up at her, his eyes full of the same silent understanding he always seemed to have. He gave a soft whine, his tail wagging just slightly. It was as though he was telling her that they didn't need to say much. The bond between them was enough. Serafina appeared beside her, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The road ahead will be difficult, but you've proven yourself. You've done more than I could have hoped for." Tiana turned to her mentor, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. "I couldn't have done it without you, Serafina. Without Max." Serafina nodded, her gaze shifting to the path ahead. "The unseen hand will regroup, but they've been shaken. They won't make the same mistake again. But there's more to this than just them. You're part of something bigger now, Tiana. Something that could change everything. Tiana's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Serafina smiled, though it was tinged with a seriousness that sent a chill down Tiana's spine. You've learned to control your power. But there are others out there, others who have the same abilities, who may not use them for good. The world is filled with forces that we can't even begin to understand. It's time to prepare. Time to build alliances. The unseen hand is just one part of the greater threat we face. Tiana's heart pounded as the weight of Serafina's words sank in. She wasn't just training to fight rogue groups like the unseen hand, she was being prepared for something far more dangerous. Something that could threaten everything. Then we'll face it together, Tiana said, her voice steady, her resolve unshaken. Serafina gave a small nod of approval. Together, she echoed. The three of them stood there in silence for a moment, each one lost in their thoughts, contemplating the battles yet to come. The weight of the world seemed to settle on Tiana's shoulders, but there was something freeing about it. She wasn't carrying it alone. She had her friends. She had Max. And more than anything, she had herself. The night sky was beginning to darken, the first stars of the evening slowly beginning to twinkle in the sky. Tiana looked up, her mind spinning with possibilities, with plans, with everything they would need to do in the coming months. But for the first time, she felt ready. Ready for whatever the future held. We'll need to regroup, learn what we can from the leader, Elias's voice cut through the quiet, his figure emerging from the tree lean. He had been on watch while they took a moment to gather their thoughts, ever vigilant, ever focused. Tiana nodded, her thoughts now fully in the present. What do we do next? Serafina looked at her, a knowing smile crossing her lips. Next. We keep fighting. We keep moving forward. One step at a time. It was as though a weight had lifted from Tiana's chest. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for a future where she could protect those she loved, and a future where the world could be free from the darkness that threatened to consume it. Tiana glanced down at Max, who looked up at her with a quiet, unwavering loyalty. He would follow her anywhere, and she would do the same. They were a team, and that meant they would face whatever came next, together. Let's go, Tiana said, her voice filled with determination. We've got work to do. With one last look at the fading daylight, Tiana turned to follow Serafina and Elias, her heart set on the journey ahead. She didn't know where it would take them, or what dangers they would face, but one thing was certain, she would never stop fighting. Not as long as there was breath in her lungs, and not as long as Max was by her side. This was just the beginning. The world had no idea what was coming, but they would soon learn. Because Tiana wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a force, and nothing would stop her from protecting the future. With that resolve, she took her first step forward into the unknown, Max at her side, and the light of a new beginning shining on the horizon. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?